How would you critique the Google Maps app? Hey everyone, welcome back to another Exponent product design mock interview. My name is Kevin Wei, and today we have a very exciting design mock interview for you guys. We have Alan, and we're going to be doing an iOS app critique. And before we jump into that, Alan, do you want to just tell the audience a little bit about who you are?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Alan. I've been a product designer for almost a decade now. Right now, I'm doing freelance design work, but I was recently at Facebook and a number of startups before that. Yeah, excited to be here today to do a mock interview.
Great. So for today's question, this is what I want to ask. How would you critique the Google Maps app?
Yeah. So I think when it comes to app critiques, I think there's kind of a standardized formula that you can look at that would apply for both startups and big companies. But you really want to break down kind of your thought process into three core pillars. The first is going to be product thinking, which is sort of how do you relate a product's physical manifestation to the company's goals? Like, why would Google make a Maps app to begin with? What's the business value that it's adding? How is it adding that value? What's the vision for it? Where could it go in the future? All those kinds of things. The other two are a little bit more on sort of the actual skills of designing, which is going to be visual design, color, type, hierarchy, information, all of that stuff. And then the third is going to be interaction. So when you talk about a flow and you think about sort of a user's experience sort of in the real world, for example, Google Maps, someone's driving down the road, how do you introduce an alert that there's an accident ahead in a conscious way that isn't going to distract them from driving? So interaction really starts to think about sort of the experience in the real world and how the technology and the product kind of interacts with that. So product thinking, visual design, and interaction are sort of the three areas to touch on and think about.
Cool. So if we were to kind of use Google Maps as an example, how would you start the interview?
Yeah, so I'll just go in that order and probably jump around a little bit as we play around with the app. But I'll just kind of first talk about the product itself and the reason why Google would work on something like this. If we go all the way back to Google in its beginning days, it started as a search engine, right? That sort of atomic piece became really, really useful for so many use cases. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense for when you're navigating somewhere, you need to search for where you're going. And so their sort of core business of search extends itself really well to a use case like navigation and trying to understand where you're going. Now, I think what came later that's really great for Google is sort of when you think about getting places and kind of mapping the world, you start to also touch on businesses and experiences that people are going to have with restaurants, with grocery stores, with any number of kinds of locations. And so in that way, they're also kind of helping small businesses by being discoverable. They're able to kind of push you in the right direction, say to find a reservation when you need it. And so the Google Maps app actually becomes so much more than, hey, how do I get downtown? But it actually is like, oh, I want to have dinner tonight. What restaurant is in this neighborhood? And has a reservation link on Google Maps that I can click. And so I think that Google Maps overall has a lot of extended value just beyond its core kind of navigating use case. And that's obviously very important for Google to have. So just immediately kind of looking at it, I'll say that one of the really hard things, I think, if I were a designer working on this, to visually balance is all of this color. And I think that they've done a really fantastic job of trying to keep your attention in the places where you need it the most. So one example of a design sort of decision here that kind of sits at the intersection between visual design and interaction design is the way that they've decided to show me the places that are currently highlighted. So all of these restaurants, Wooden Spoon, the sushi place, ramen, these are all places that I visit frequently because this is my neighborhood. And so they're showing me that because they understand that. So they're taking into account places that I go frequently, and then they're showing it to me in a thoughtful way that's not overwhelming to the rest of the map. But you'll notice like above, around the areas, there's not as much, even though I know that there's tons of businesses there. That's just because they don't want to overwhelm me, right? If I start to zoom in though, again, a really nice interaction here is that I'm showing the intent to discover and to learn more. And so then they introduce this opportunity of, okay, here's all these other businesses. Here's even like the outline of the businesses. I can see all of these different buildings on my block, and I can get really granular with the detail here, but only when I've decided to zoom in, right? They've understood that I'm seeking more information, and so then they're showing me that. And at the same time, they're balancing all of these different object types on the map with a um, really well balanced color palette that everything kind of complements each other in a really sophisticated way. I think I think one of those I think one of the ways that it does it in a sophisticated way is that it attributes kind of a color to a certain business type. So even here you can see there's some shopping, which is blue, and then you have food, which is orange. It's really basic, but uh, it's important, right? Because it establishes sort of a pattern that is memorable. So when you're searching in a new neighborhood or something and you're looking for a restaurant, you'll just look for the orange. You won't even need to sort out anything else.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things that I saw when you zoomed in was not only all the external, like exterior mapping, like you see the streets, you can even see the addresses, but even the interior mapping. I think if you zoomed into like the cafe there, you can
Yeah.
even see like where the restroom is.
Yeah, and that's super cool. If I were to go to, for example, let's see, like Westfield Mall, these really big places where that really becomes super important. Um, this looks like it's maybe bugging out because this does not look sophisticated or well designed, but maybe this could be a point of of discussion really to talk about of like why does it look like this. But yeah, I think that's like a really brilliant move on their part to literally map the world. It comes with so many use cases because as humans, we're constantly, I need to go get something to eat. I need to, go see this friend. I need to go to this place. And so Google Maps just becomes such an integral part of your entire life for so many different use cases.
Cool. I think that was really cool to talk about the use of color palettes, just to help the user identify what is what. Um, is there anything else about the interactions in Google Maps? Anything else that you wanted to point out?
A ton. So let's say if I was trying to drive to Santa Cruz, right? And I tap on directions, I think that there's so much that you could talk about with this flow. And I think we take it for granted because it's such an established pattern. But just this flow of moving the user from I'm planning where I need to go versus being in the actual environment of driving to where you need to go. These are two totally different experiences for the person where they're probably happening sometimes at different times, sometimes right before one another. But taking into account sort of um, this experience with Google Maps when you open it, I think is actually a crazy design problem because you know that the person is moving from being by themselves or sitting in a car or whatever to driving the car, which changes everything, right? There's like safety that has to come into play. There's the actual navigation itself, how you kind of present this UI to show large components when you know someone's driving, um, how you interact with all of these elements on the map. Like, do you still show the businesses? Is it relevant to someone who's driving? Probably not, right? So it's like there's so many of these product and interaction decisions that have to be made. And you can tell that just by looking at this screen, it's such a different experience than being here. It's like two totally different modes, right? And so as a designer myself, I would imagine that, these could almost be different teams of people working on this. Like it's a completely different mind space to be in and requires a whole different level of thought and care because there is actual, safety involved.
Totally. And if you were to improve the sort of like navigation experience, is there anything that you would change?
Oh yeah, my biggest gripe with Google Maps is that the street the letters for the streets do not always show when you need them. And this has happened to me so many times trying to navigate SF. A lot of
Hmm.
times on a bike, for example, where I know I need to make a left turn in like 2 or 3 blocks, but I'll get to a red light and I like will quickly check. But then the route itself will be blocking the street, and you have to kind of zoom in and play with it in such an annoying way that it can really mess you up if you don't know exactly where you're going. So here, like while I'm sitting at my desk, it might not seem like a big deal. So it's like, okay, you zoom in, you clearly see it says 15th Street, but there's always this period where it's like, it's finicky, right? It's like, okay, I need to make a right here, but what is it? And when you're on a bike or you're in the real world, these kinds of like split second, millisecond decisions really matter. Like if the light just turned green and there's a bunch of people behind me, I can't be like playing with my phone to figure out what was the street name that I need to turn on. So I think that there's a lot of things you could do here, right? I think being more smart about how, for example, words along the route, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but like the street names that you're going to be interacting with should probably be a little bit bigger and obvious to you than everything else around it, because the Safeway and all this other stuff, it doesn't really matter. I'm trying to figure out like what's the street that I need to turn on. So arguably those things should be easier to find and bigger.
Yeah, yeah, there's a hierarchy of like what's important to the user, and it's probably not being prioritized right in some use cases.
Yeah, and again, I think this goes back to what is the mode that the person is in. So, if I were actually leaving to go to Santa Cruz right now, well, I'm sitting at my desk. And so, sure, this is all good and fine, and still seeing the businesses around me is fine. But when I'm kind of on my way to something, this has to change a lot and be a lot more obvious. To your point, the information hierarchy has to be a lot more obvious as to what I'm actually trying to do in that moment, and really trying to isolate just to that thing and reduce all of the clutter when I come into this new mode. I really wish it was something that Google would fix, because I actually run into this problem so often, and it seems like such a small thing, but these kinds of microsecond interactions that don't feel great really add up and kind of can make a really good experience not great.
Mm. So if you were a designer on Google Maps, how would you define what that hierarchy of information would be for the user?
I think one really easy place to start is to just think about where are they coming from and what kind of mode might they be in. So you can see in Google Maps, I've selected Santa Cruz. It's given me all of these route options. Obviously, if I'm not going to walk to Santa Cruz, but if I were walking versus taking a bike versus driving a car versus flying versus taking a train, these are all super different modes, all of which you can account for environmental factors that would inform potentially design decisions, right? So if I'm on a train, I'm obviously not driving, and maybe information about my destination, businesses around the train stop that I'm going to get off at would be more useful. Versus if I'm driving, you're going to really want to highlight and show, where you need to turn next. And so that would probably be a really easy way to start, though um, I don't think it's 100% a solution, because people can change modes, and you wouldn't really want to rely on that 100%, but that would at least get some ideas going and could really inform a very thoughtful experience across these different travel types.
Got it. So you think about like who the user are, and then you figure out like what's most important to them, right? Like for like you mentioned, for someone on public transit, it's probably like when they need to get off, what are the restaurants around them? And I guess for driving, it's like, where do I turn? What are the safety things I need to be considerate about? Like where the stop signs are, maybe things like that.
Yeah, always taking into account the environment. I think when it comes to products that deal with a lot of interaction in the physical world, methods of storyboarding are incredibly helpful. Airbnb is notorious for this, where they, actually brought in Pixar designers to design storyboards of like what the Airbnb experience is, like what does it feel like to meet a host and to stay in their place. And arguably Google Maps has a really similar problem where you have all these environmental factors and contingencies in the real world. And you have to think really deeply about how can you account for various factors, basically, right? Are you driving and it's rainy and there's a traffic accident ahead? There's just so many different things that you could think about. And you could even push it a step further by, as a designer, helping your engineering team develop a plan to algorithmically understand and figure out these things. So what if actually you as a designer didn't have to come up with a full list of things that happen, but we actually use data that we get from everyone who's using Google Maps to inform further design decisions for these different experiences.
Cool. So we've covered the business case around why Google Maps is important. We've covered a lot of the UI elements like the color palette and interactions. Is there anything else that you would talk about in an app critique interview?
Yeah, I mean, I think with app critiques, if you get kind of lost, it is always good to think about what you truly think of the app. Like if you actually use the app, truly think about the kinds of things that you would actually want to change. Don't feel like you need to come up with some genius answer to satisfy the interviewer. I think you can just kind of candidly give your thoughts and provide evidence and reasoning for your thoughts through the framework of product thinking, interaction design, and visual design. So, for example, my actual personal gripe with Google Maps is the sizing of the street names. It actually really ticks me off. And you'll notice how I talk about that, and then I kind of back that up with the, framework of this is kind of an interaction visual design problem. I could go into a lot of other things as well about how Google Maps is actually a competitor to Yelp. And then you could talk about how is Yelp actually different from Google Maps, and should Google Maps, should they be going in different directions, or should Google Maps acquire Yelp? And if so, how would Yelp get integrated into the app, and what benefits would that give Google? And you could go really deep into the product thinking as well if you have personal thoughts on the way that the business is, or just any thoughts you have, really, but always taking it back to the framework of product thinking, interaction design, and visual design. I think that's very standard. And if you do that at a 5-person startup or a 5,000-person company, you'll be in really good shape.
Yeah, and I think the question that I gave you today, which is how would you critique the Google Maps app, was a very broad sort of question, and you kind of honed it into navigation and restaurants. Is that something that you would typically do in a mock interview where you scope the answer on your own?
Yeah, so I think with app critiques, the thing that I've kind of learned is don't feel silly to go in on like really specific small details, because you can actually talk about like I could talk to you about this orange that they've chosen for these restaurants for probably an hour, right? And it seems kind of silly because you would never go to your friend and talk about the orange color of restaurants on Google Maps, but in an app critique, you want to get really, really specific. So if you're not sure where to start, just look at it and say, well, here's what I'm seeing and here's what I think about it.
Got it. Cool. Thanks, Alan. I think this wraps up our mock interview today. So for the viewers who are watching at home, I hope this was helpful, and good luck with your upcoming product design interviews.
Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons below to let us know that this video was valuable for you. And of course, check out hundreds more videos just like this at tryexponent.com. Thanks for watching, and good luck on your upcoming interview.